Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about that classic battle between liberty and security. And this is in the context of a unique piece of legislation called the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians Act, also known as the NSICOP Act. The NSICOP Act creates a committee of parliamentarians who are given the authority to access information that the government would otherwise rather not disclose, highly confidential material. The law requires that these parliamentarians keep the material confidential, and if they disclose it, even in Parliament, they can be subject to criminal penalties with a sentence of up to 14 years in prison. This law is the reason Pierre Poilievre never obtained his security clearance. His rationale is that the NSICOP Act places him in a catch-22 because it is likely unconstitutional. Why does he think that? Well, an Ontario court said it was. The law was challenged by Professor Ryan Alford, and that decision, though, was overturned on appeal, and the case is now heading to the Supreme Court, where the charity that I work for, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, will be intervening. Here today to talk about that case is Ryan Alford, and we're also joined by Paul-Erik Veel, the lawyer who is representing the CCF in the case as an intervener. So thank you both so much for joining me today. First, can you tell me about NSICOP and what it does broadly? What type of issues is it designed to deal with, Professor Alford?
Essentially, it's going to be a parliamentary mechanism for reviewing intelligence activities. So it serves the same function as the oversight and providing some form of accountability as you see in other Westminster democracies, Canada being the last of those to adopt such a committee.
So, Paul-Erik, do we have any examples? I know that the whole idea is that the material reviewed by the committee is confidential, but we do have a sense of the types of issues that is being considered and the types of issues that are disclosed to, and the details of which are confidential, but what is disclosed to NSICOP. So, what types of issues do we know is already before NSICOP or has been before NSICOP?
So they have a very broad mandate. They are empowered to look at anything dealing with the legislative or regulatory or policy sides of national security intelligence issues and really any ongoing national security issue, leaving aside ongoing operations. There's a carve out for that. So if there's an active operation going on that the prime minister deems would be injurious to national security, they can't look at that, but broadly speaking, it's carte blanche for any other intelligence or national security related activities. So a very, very broad jurisdiction.
And Professor Alford, are there any examples of specific issues that they've considered?
Well, a very interesting one recently, which was whether or not there was foreign electoral interference, including in the activities of the Canadian Parliament. And then if you go back, you also see instances where particularly embarrassing possible scandals are referred by a minister to that committee. So initially, the question of how a registered terrorist was invited to an embassy party at the Canadian Embassy in New Delhi.
That's what's so unusual about this to me. So, who is it that is actually deciding when an issue will be before NSICOP, Ryan?
So it's actually a hybrid. So sometimes it's when it's a referral by a minister, and then sometimes it's part of this more systematic role whereby the committee itself can initiate particular reviews.
And Paul-Erik, is there a concern that this is going to be used to sort of sweep in otherwise politically just embarrassing facts into the purview of this committee and sort of shielding that issue from more public debate that might otherwise be going on?
Well, absolutely. There's a very real concern about that. I mean, look, at a high level, the intention of having a committee like this and the idea of having some oversight is obviously a good one. It's hard to argue with that. But the combination of, as Ryan says, the dual hybrid way that the committee derives its jurisdiction and the broad confidentiality restrictions that are associated with that create a very real risk that this will become a place to send controversial political issues to and potentially try and bury them to some extent.
Ryan, very briefly, anything you want to add there?
No, I would just agree, and I would say what's particularly problematic is you have these methods to censor and restrict the information coming out of the committee that are controlled by the Prime Minister's office because it's not actually a parliamentary committee, but rather an executive committee.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And while I agree with the general idea of security, it seems like some details are not quite right here. We've got to go to break, but we'll be back.